I'd like to express my appreciation to the Stegner Center for really involving us planners in many ways with regard to this symposium, which is obviously very relevant to our field. And one of the ways I'm particularly excited to be involved is that this room is full of my students. So the Stegner Symposium organizers opened it up so that not only is my class here today, my class, everyone who's in class right now, say hi.
Oh,
hey,
right.
guys.
All right.
I'm taking attendance in the back of my head. And a bunch of other students from our department as well. So we have a bunch of grad students who are also here. All of those other planning students. Hi, guys. Great to see you all here. So thank you to the Stegner Center. This is awesome to have this planning involvement and to have this symposium come here that I didn't have to organize, which is also really great. So I'll stop talking and go ahead and introduce our panelists for this second session, which is entitled Rethinking Urban Design. Our three panelists this morning are Jonathan Rosenbloom, down on the end, Professor of Law, Drake University Law School, Rocky Piro, Executive Director of the Colorado Center for Sustainable Urbanism at the University of Colorado, Denver, and Rob Bennett, CEO of EcoDistricts. And that is the extent of the introduction I will give. They'll each have 20 minutes, which will be rigorously monitored by a timekeeper, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And while we wait for a second just to get the presentation up, a special thanks also to Michelle, to Aaron, to Jan, the University of Utah, and the Wallace Stegner Center. It's truly an honor to be here. This morning, I'd like to explore land use as opportunities and constraints that can either support resilient infrastructure or can exacerbate some vulnerabilities in infrastructure and really separate communities from their ecosystems. I'd like to begin with a story, and perhaps one that is not quite as riveting or as risque as my title might suggest, which you'll know once we get up here, but the title is it's 50 Shades of Green. So as I said, though, not quite as risque, so don't get overly excited. But 50 Shades of Green, planning for uncertainties in the relationship between land use and infrastructure. But the story that I'd like to begin with takes place in Iowa, where I live, and it involves one piece of infrastructure that is facing three diverse and intense disturbances over the course of a relatively short amount of time. And the story takes place in the time frame of 2012 to 2013. During that time, Iowa was in the midst of a severe to exceptional to extreme drought throughout the state. The infrastructure during that time was put under immense pressure, whether we're talking about transportation, energy, emergency services, but particularly relevant to this story here, the water infrastructure was put under immense stress. This is an image of a tributary from during that time. This tributary leads to one of the two main water sources that the Des Moines Water Works draws from to provide potable water to over 500,000 people in central Iowa. And you get a sense of how bad the conditions were and how difficult it must have been for the infrastructure, for the Des Moines Water Works, to provide services during that time. While the waterworks was struggling with how to provide potable water, the drought ended with flash flooding in over 19 inches of rainfall during the spring of 2013. That amount of rain, 19 inches during the spring, was the most that we had experienced since 1892. And so, in a very quick amount of time, the infrastructure, the waterworks, went from trying to provide potable water to having too much water. Like droughts, floods are not all that uncommon now in central Iowa. This is an image of a flood we had in 1993. The Des Moines Water Works is actually those series of buildings up here on the left side of the screen. They're under 8 feet of water there. They were unable to provide potable water for about 3 weeks. And as I said, these floods are not infrequent now. They occurred also in 2007, 2008, 2010, 12, 13, the year relevant to our story here, as well as last year. This is an image from 2008, although you can see at this point we adapted, right? We instituted some berms around the waterworks so that we could provide potable water and protect ourselves from the 500-year flood, although it happens now with some regularity. In addition, though, to bringing overwhelming volumes of water, the change in moisture also stressed the infrastructure by changing the ecology. This chart that's on the board is showing you the amount of nitrate, or the measures of the nitrates that are coming into the facility at the Des Moines Waterworks during the flood. The dates are down here. Again, this is during the spring, and there is a large spike in the nitrate levels. The EPA maximum for nitrate is set forth in the green bar across the screen. That's 10 parts per million. The spikes here are well in excess of that. Well, the waterworks now has to struggle with that. They have to pull the nitrates out. Accordingly, in Des Moines, we have one of the most sophisticated reverse osmosis systems in the world. We get the pleasure of running that system of $5,000 to $7,000 a day to remove these out. And in fact, because this happens with some regularity now, we also have to update the system now, and that looks like it's going to cost somewhere between $25 and $30 million. This is the nitrates from just a couple months ago, and you can see again, above the 10 parts per million line, both the Raccoon and the Des Moines River. Those are the two main streams that the waterworks pulls from. The bottom line is the finished water that comes out of the reverse osmosis system. Now, I think there's a number of things that we can talk about from this example, but I think one of the things that's most telling is that this really reflects the day-to-day operations of one facility. And those day-to-day operations include flood, they include drought, they include changes in ecology, and the stresses that this infrastructure is under. And so the question is, how can land use laws make this better? How can land use support the building of resilient infrastructure to prepare for these kind of rapid and intense disturbances? This is a question I'm going to look at today, and I'll do it really in three parts. The first part will really kind of backcast. What's an ideal vision of what land use laws might look like? It's the idea that if we could wipe the slate clean and we could redraft land use laws, how would we draft them so that they support resilient infrastructure? Next, we'll turn to how existing land use laws themselves are actually an obstacle to promoting a resilient infrastructure. And then I'll conclude with some ideas on how to overcome these obstacles and create a land use system that really accommodates uncertainties and disturbances. Okay, so what might land use law look like when it supports resilient infrastructure? Now, for argument's sake, I define resilient infrastructure as follows. And I understand there's a whole bunch of stuff packed in here, and we can talk about that, but I wanted to get through this part about defining resilient infrastructure quickly so we could then look at, well, how could land use laws really support that? And so one way to define resilient infrastructure is a system of intelligent and integrated infrastructure that resists. It absorbs disturbances and rebounds quickly. It adapts. It learns constantly. It anticipates changes. It responds. It operates flexibly. And it continually changes. And it transforms. It rebuilds. It recreates in a timely manner, an efficient manner to preserve, restore, or improve a system's essential functions. Now, land use laws that could support this vision of infrastructure will obviously vary by jurisdiction. Cities face vastly different needs, opportunities, assets, ecosystems, conditions, and legal frameworks. That said, I think there are some similarities across jurisdictions when we're talking about land use that could support resilient infrastructure. And they include that land use laws almost across the board impact infrastructure, whether we're talking about transportation or water or energy or waste. They're fixing land use patterns in a way that alters the infrastructure, and they're doing it at a number of different scales, whether we're talking about comprehensive plans, zoning overlays, some of the building codes we just talked about, variances, conditional use. These are all having an impact on infrastructure. So though if we could start anew, the land use laws that I think have some cross-cutting aspects to them that would benefit or support that vision of infrastructure would include these three aspects. First, the system of land use laws would incorporate systems thinking, or polyresilience view of infrastructure as an integrated system. So instead of addressing stormwater over here, energy over here, transportation over here, we begin to think of these things as an integrated system. And this is particularly relevant for land use, which has its fingers in all of these things. And in fact, Chris Dirksen in his last presentation was talking about how important water is to energy. And the reverse is true as well, how important energy is to water. And so thinking about these things as an integrated system in the land use laws themselves. Second, incorporating adaptive governance, in which land use laws facilitate, number one, the obtaining of information. So through the laws, we're able to access information relevant to how social ecological systems are changing and how those changes are altering the infrastructure. Number two, providing for the monitoring and assessing of that information. So as the information comes in, we're able to learn something from that. And then also as part of that, we're able to adapt. So we adapt the land use laws, but we also adapt the infrastructure. And then finally, land use laws would incorporate an ecosystem services approach in which the law embraces the benefits of ecosystems that can often get stronger over time. And again, the idea with this is just to say, in the abstract, how could we support this vision of resilient infrastructure through land use laws? And they would incorporate these three aspects. Now, unfortunately, as currently drafted, land use laws are doing very little of this. And local governments face a number of different challenges in trying to do so. I've listed some of those challenges on the board. We've talked about a bunch of these already, including legal frameworks in terms of preemption. Many of you are familiar with the politics of local government, meaning that if you show up at a planning commission, you start talking about sustainability, resilience, climate change, not going to get too far. Financing is obviously a huge issue in terms of these projects, including looking at land use laws and trying to figure out a way to adapt them. Collective action challenges among local governments, cultural, behavioral aspects, meaning developers and city staff have a certain tradition that they're working to. So these are all challenges, but what I really want to focus on for purposes of how to integrate land use laws, how to rather use land use laws to support resilient infrastructure, is the last one here. And that is the existing land use laws themselves really serve as an obstacle to creating resilient infrastructure. And they do so in two primary ways. The first is they are focused on stationarity. So the existing laws are focused on stationarity, and the second is that they're focused on gray infrastructure. And by gray infrastructure, I'm talking about man-made, human-engineered solutions to infrastructure, often including concrete, steel, asphalt, and so on. So just a quick word about these two aspects of existing land use laws. First, stationarity is summed up nicely by this C.S. Halling quote. Here it says, "In a system anticipating transformation." Now, a system that would anticipate transformation, this is one of the ideals that I put up there for land use laws, right? This is the idea that when there are changes, we can alter the resilience of the infrastructure, right? But in a system to anticipate transformation, he says, in a flip from one state to another, laws are truly of limited help because the transformed system has unknown key variables and processes and unknown risks and opportunities emerge. The idea here is that the laws are fixed in time. There's little opportunity to adapt and ascertain the uncertainties as they come. And this is particularly true with land use laws, where the physical manifestation of the laws is reflected in a rigid, static built environment and infrastructure that is not prepared for changing circumstances. So this is one element of the existing laws, and that is stationarity. The second challenge we're facing is that land use laws often enhance vulnerabilities by focusing on exclusively, if not predominantly, gray infrastructure, which exacerbates the rigidity of the stationarity. And so you have these two working together, that the law is fixed in time, and what it's promoting is a gray infrastructure that is also fixed in time. So let me give you two quick examples. As many of you know, a traditional comp plan can take 1 to 4 years to develop. We do all this upfront work. We have dozens of meetings. We meet with hundreds of people. We integrate all these comments into it. But then what we do is we fix land use patterns for the next 10 to 20 years. Our comp plan in Des Moines is a good example of this. This is our comp plan up on the board, the map of it, and it's 16 years old. But the city, its population, its economy, its ecology, we talked about the droughts, the floods, the increase in nitrates, these have all changed in the past 16 years, but the patterns in the land use plan have remained static. Now, of course, we can amend the comp plan, but there's little, if anything, developed right into the comp plan to help monitor these changes and help adapt when necessary. Another example in existing land use laws that echoes this element of stationarity, as well as gray infrastructure, is the use of site plan reviews. And I like this example because site plan reviews are very common across the country, but also site plan reviews integrate many different aspects of land use. And I'm going to talk about two of them, which is tree removal and probably one of folks' most favorite part about land use laws, parking minimum lots. So like comprehensive plans, site plan reviews do not track changes in social ecological systems. In Des Moines, for example, we recently had a fairly common site plan review request, and it was for this site that is up on the board here. The request was for a 220-unit development on 18 acres. The request, like many, included almost all of the clearing of the trees on the site for various forms of gray infrastructure, including streets, but detention ponds as well. And as an example for what they were thinking about on this site, they turned to the site that was just to the west of it, to your left. And you can see in that site the asphalt, the streets that are laid out there. You can also see one detention pond that is on the map about here, but there were, I think, two others on the site as well. So pursuant to their request, though, they were going to remove all of the trees. The tree removal ordinance in Iowa, in Des Moines rather, which of course varies throughout the country, I've set up on the board here, and I just want to look at this relevant part down in the bottom. It says, tree removal shall be allowed without mitigation when such removal is required to conform with any infrastructure requirements, including streets, sidewalks, and stormwater detention. So here's an example where we're removing the trees and we're placing in gray infrastructure, but there's no requirement that we ascertain, well, what are the benefits of the trees? Are they perhaps helping with stormwater, the very thing we're removing them for? Are they helping with climate mitigation, something the last panel talked about? Are they helping with soil retention and other ecosystem benefits? But there's no tracking of this at all. So based on this ordinance, only about 30% of the trees that were removed from the site had to be replaced. This is the information that the developer is required to put forward for site plan removal, again in Des Moines. And again, much of it is based on gray infrastructure. But I want to focus on the bottom one here. They also have to say that they've complied with the minimum parking requirements. Pursuant to these, most developers are required to install a minimum amount of parking and can typically exceed these. I have an example up here on the board. This example is from Clive, Iowa, which is just right next door to Des Moines. For every 1,000 square feet in a restaurant, the developer has to construct 15 parking spaces. So here where the restaurant, which is the McDonald's, is 4,000 square feet, the developer had to put in 60 spots. Let me give you one other example here. This was a development in West Des Moines, which is, again, just adjacent to Des Moines. Here the developer was required to put in 448 parking slots, but requested 691 slots, which they could do under the code, and they were granted that right. Now, again, we can have a whole discussion about whether or not these are used, and from these images, it's pretty clear they're not, and from my personal interaction with them, they're not. But what's more important, I think, for these purposes, is that there's no telling, or there's no reason, there's no requirement that the developer or anyone in the city has to determine what is the impact on the infrastructure here, right? How is this affecting transportation? How is this affecting stormwater management? How is it affecting the flooding and the changes in the watershed that we're seeing in Iowa? Now, in cities like Los Angeles, where parking can be as high as 14% of the land area, these provisions put immense strain on infrastructure, including water and energy. Now, these examples, of course, only scratch the surface of the many codes and the many provisions that are set forth in the many cities throughout the country, but they highlight the need to look into the details of land use laws and question whether they are unintentionally locking cities into patterns of inflexibility that fail to account for uncertainty and changes as social ecological systems. So if we come full circle now, how can we begin to rethink existing land use laws to implement our ideal vision and overcome the obstacles that we just discussed? And because land use laws cover a whole scale of different issues and laws, again, ranging from comprehensive plan to, let's say, details of light fixtures and other hazards, health hazards and health hazards, there are a number of opportunities, but what we need to first set up is some sort of process to figure out where in the land use laws we would focus. And so I've started to detail some of that process here, but this becomes an important aspect, right? Because the idea, and this is something that Chris Dirksen was talking about, is we need to identify what are the obstacles, what are the incentives, and what are the mandates that we want to put in place. Well, this is one sort of way in which we can do this, the process, and it would begin by the mapping of desired services and associated infrastructure. What do we want as a community for our services and our infrastructure? Next, we determine the risks associated with that infrastructure. Then we look at the metrics. How do we determine whether or not those risks are coming to fruition? What are other risks and changes that we're seeing? Then we identify available assets. We determine where in the land use code that infrastructure is being impacted, and then we redraft the laws and we evaluate, we adapt. Let me give you a couple examples very quickly that implement this strategy. I'm going to start with, in 2012, Dubuque, Iowa began tracking its performance relative to resilience. The city selected 12 principles, including clean water and energy, as a way to check their own resilience. And for each of these, they established metrics. There were 60 metrics in total. One of the metrics for clean water pertained to stream segments, impaired stream segments. And what they found as they tracked it was that they were getting more and more impaired streams. And so based on this information, they again began to adapt. And they adapted by adopting an ecosystem services approach in the first instance, in which they changed 240 alleyways that were asphalt to permeable pavement. It reduced stormwater management by 80%. It's a very small step, but it's an important example, I think, because they started at a very high scale with adaptive governance. They were monitoring, assessing, and then they worked into an ecosystem services approach. In addition, cities throughout the country, including Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and others, are integrating green infrastructure and low-impact development throughout their site plans. I've listed listed in this chart is a number of green infrastructure and ecosystem services approach that folks are adapting into these plans. And then the ecosystem services are set forth, including the infrastructure benefits on the top. But to give this some more teeth, what we're doing at Drake University is we're starting to draft ordinances. We have 15 ordinances that we've drafted to date that attempt to incorporate ecosystem services and, let's try this. There we go. Ecosystem services and other tactics. They're pertaining to energy efficiency, stormwater management, and others. For each of these ordinances, and these are model ordinances, we have an abstract, we have the model ordinance itself, and then we have a summary of the costs and the benefit research that is out there. One of these ordinances, for example, is we've flipped minimum parking lots and made them maximum parking lots. So if a developer wants to exceed maximum parking lots, they can do so. There's flexibility built into the ordinance, but they have to integrate ecosystem services in a number of different ways to alleviate the impacts they're having on water infrastructure.
Jonathan, just so you know, your time is up.
Okay, well, let me end then. Thank you. This is a great ordinance from Sebastopol that maybe the folks who talk about energy would get into. They're requiring that solar voltaic cells go on during the site plan management process. And so that's the point that I'll end on, and that's that it's important that if we talk about energy and we talk about other infrastructure, that these are actually being drafted into the land use laws themselves, and we can consider land use laws as opportunities to really begin to think about how to redraft and incorporate resilient infrastructure. Thanks, and I look forward to your comments.
Yeah, it's right up there. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Sarah.
I wasn't sure how to.
Thank you.
All right. Just make sure I got the right gizmos here. Oops. Try this gizmo. All right. Did I do that? Sorry. Get it full screen again. Oh, is it down here? Okay. Maybe we should have a little chat before I start to make sure I don't make any more mistakes.
You're okay.
Okay. So just go up there and, yeah, okay.
And then full screen.
Just full screen, perfect. Okay, all right, thank you. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. I very much enjoyed the sunset on the other side of the Continental Divide last night, and just find this fun to be here in Utah and see all the amazing things that's happening with urbanism and population growth and sustainable planning. My presentation today is a little eclectic, I'll say. I'm not a lawyer. I'm an urban planner myself, and so I want to share with you various trends, emerging issues, things that are transforming in the experience of planning here in the U.S. I want to spend some time particularly sharing with you our National Association of Planners Sustaining Places initiative and give you a good overview of various aspects of that. I'm doing some work right now looking specifically at the transformation of regional planning, and so I want to share some of that information with you, knowing that we share a theme here this morning on urban design. There are many lessons to be learned there. Jonathan did a great job of talking about systems thinking and holistic planning that we are, I think, indebted to urban design professionals for bringing that into a new way of doing business and making decisions. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the prospects where things are going. I find it's probably better for me to stand a little closer to the microphone. Okay. Quick, just a shameless commercial about where I work right now. I'm with the Colorado Center of Sustainable Urbanism. We just launched this in September, so we're still a relatively new organization. And yes, Chris mentioned the Sustainable Development Code project that he launched several years ago with the Rocky Mountain Land Use Institute. We're moving that. That's going to be one of our key initiatives here at the center to not just have that live and as a resource, but be able to do ongoing maintenance, addition, and really make it a living resource. We have several focal areas, so being housed within the university allows us to do a lot of research around issues of sustainability. We're doing a lot of work in the Denver area along the Colorado Front Range and throughout the state already, providing technical assistance on a variety of planning and urban development issues. What I just mentioned about the zoning code, we want to be doing more of that. We're working on 5 other initiatives like that where we'll have toolkits, best practices, dealing with sustainability. And we're beginning to take on some opportunities to have forums. Nothing as robust as this yet, but maybe in 21 years we can have same sort of gathering and conversation that we're having this week here with you. Sustainable urbanism. So what is that in particular? So you'll see as you look at this that it embodies many of the issues that have been talked about by other speakers already this morning around sustainability. So it's how to deal with multiple issues: development, the economy, mobility, other infrastructure, that simultaneously advances well-being of people, creative economic vitality here, and ensuring that the environment is healthy, where it's been damaged, that we restore it and heal the environment as well. And I really emphasize the ands. I know there's kind of debates once again in the world of sustainability, but don't you really have to go into trade-offs? And I mean, of course, there's complexity here, But I think for me, personally as a professional and something that I'll continue to advocate, you have to have those benefits, even if there are trade-offs in that arena there. So let's start then looking a little bit at where we've been in planning and how our discussion of sustainability today fits into all of that. You can see that the early days of planning, and Chris I think had a really good slide too, showing how zoning began to emerge and take some standing and status in the U.S. here. So initially there were issues around health and sanitation that started to make us scratch our heads a little bit and say, can't we do better? And maybe we need something like planning to kind of set some common rules and common aspirations of what we want to have happen in our built environments here. And early on, a lot of this was around parks and public space planning too. So some of the early, if you will, more comprehensive types of planning efforts are things like Boston's Emerald Necklace, Chicago too, with its Green Park and regional plans. Many other metro areas did that too. Los Angeles was actually a leader with some of this in its early days as well. Housing and again issues around housing next to less desirable land uses, often close to factories or other things that had health-related issues. Began to see something that we needed to have a better handle on. And so about the same time that you see the enabling legislation created for zoning that Chris talked about, we have enabling legislation for planning. Transportation planning has been a major focus here, infrastructure, connectivity. Some of that was done early on, hand in glove with park and open space planning. Post-war period, we see economic development coming into play here. Public participation grew in the 60s and 70s, so rather than communities just being planned on by a bunch of professionals and decision makers, actually engage people who live in communities and have to live with these decisions to be part of that process. Are awakening to much of what was happening with environmental damage and issues around who were the people most impacted by that, issues of environmental justice then coming into play there. And then you see here things that really begin the evolution to begin to bring various issues and topics together. And we'll see that in some subsequent slides here, but rather than just kind of linear and silo types of planning things, we have smart growth, which began to bring together where we're doing development, where we're building homes and those types of communities, and how does that tie in particularly to mobility and accessibility. Sustainability starts to be used. I worked on a planning effort in Seattle. You would think Seattle would just embrace the S word right away. It took us probably about 5 years before we had some consensus among our elected officials that it was okay to use the term sustainability with what we're doing. And I mean, once it got embraced, it just ran amazingly. We're dealing now with issues around climate change and food systems. Again, we've seen some of that here with the other speakers as well. So as planning continues to evolve here, again, we're seeing this integration among topics. I mean, there was a period in time when the comp plan, and I love the slide Jonathan told you of, or showed you of Des Moines' 16-year-old comp plan. They used to just basically be land use documents here. Chris had a slide about a better world through zoning. I've actually got that bumper sticker with that slogan in my office. The other one I have, Jonathan might appreciate, is "It's the land use, stupid." So, so again, those are key issues, but they can't be dealt with in standalone silos. There are impacts. Clearly, you're hearing a theme here today already about the need to bring water planning and land use planning together here. So we have gone through a period where, again, smart growth, smart mobility, where we're looking at things more comprehensively. I love to talk when I give presentations on transportation and mobility about how land use is a part of transportation. and that needs to be factored in. It isn't just about moving vehicles and other opportunities to get from point A to B. It's very critical, what are we actually doing with land use and our development patterns here? And then the systems thinking. And again, I love what Jonathan said here, something we borrowed from design here, and we see a migration where people are working with ecosystems and bioregions now with a whole complexity of issues here. There's that saying that sustainability loves to tout here, think global, act local. I'm going to put a little tag into that too, to talk about the need for not just integrated planning in place, but integrated planning within regions where you have communities that are impacted by one another or share common concerns. So again, the sustainability diagram that we have here is becoming more and more the baseline or for a foundation with what we're doing at planning at whatever level, from the neighborhood, municipal level, regional level, and a few states as well here. And it's tie-in with other issues we've been discussing, resiliency and livability here. So, now the American Planning Association and its Sustainable Places initiative here. This is about a 5 or 6 year old initiative in terms of being formally adopted by the organization. It traces its genesis back to participation of the leadership of the association with a World Urban Forum that took place in Rio de Janeiro, I think in 2010 that was, and brought back and basically our association, I tend to be kind of a little bit of a modest or humble person here, but felt we need to be bold and show some leadership here in the U.S. with going forward with creating more complete communities, more vibrant communities, and healthy communities, and using sustainability as that framework here. So what the association is doing is creating a research agenda. Standards and principles have been put into play. I'm going to go through a few of those here in a minute. Some pilot programs and actual certification of places. So that's a new thing for us to be doing. We're basically starting with a few communities in Massachusetts, Foxborough, Wheeling, West Virginia, Goshen, Indiana, Rock Island, Illinois, Oklahoma City we mentioned. We're working with them in terms of a pilot program for how they embrace sustainability in their comprehensive plans. And a few places on the West Coast, particularly up in the Northwest, Auburn, Washington, and Seattle, Washington. So these are places where, again, we're trying to work with these communities, and some of them are in states with very rigorous laws and provisions for what comprehensive planning should be, and include others are still in states that haven't really evolved their planning legislation from the 1920s. It's just basic enabling legislation still. But to really work with these communities to make the comprehensive plan a living document, one that the community owns, one that gives purpose and sense to conversation, debates, helps establish the vision for where the community wants to go, and guides decision. And probably requires something that allows it to be living in terms of regularly being updated and not just happening at one point and just kind of drifting into irrelevancy to be. I don't want to say that Des Moines' plan was irrelevant, but the 16-year gap, I mean, the world has changed, as you pointed out, Jonathan. So these are the key principles that we're working with in this whole effort to reinvigorate planning and to rethink it within sustainability terms. A livable built environment, and I love to say that means a complete community and complete neighborhoods here. The harmony with nature. I know I've been in several planning processes where people get a little nervous when we talk about restoration and so on. What does that mean? I mean, it allows systems basically to function as naturally as possible. We're not necessarily talking about returning things to pristine states, but in a community, as we saw with those flood images from Des Moines, I mean, how can we be in harmony with the environment when there are events around flooding, drought, and so on that is in our consciousness, and our built environment respects that and is more in harmony. Resilient economy, I asked some of my colleagues in the Planning Association, what does that mean? Because I usually hear the word resiliency in terms of what we discussed earlier today, in terms of dealing with hazards or disasters. I mean, is it that, or is it more about economic prosperity? And I've been told, yes. It's not an either-or thing, it's a both-and. So it's ensuring prosperous economy, trying to deal with those boom and bust cycles that many communities go through in terms of their economic well-being, but also being smart about living in a world where there are going to be hazards, there are going to be disasters and so on, and that we're building smartly with that in mind, knowing and reading the type of environment that we're in. What maybe works in San Diego doesn't work in Salt Lake City because of the different setting. So that resiliency is very important too. The issue of interwoven equity. I mean, this is an issue I'm just really wrestling with a lot at this point in my career with folks. That it isn't just, well, we do something in an urban environment that benefits kind of the movers and shakers, the elites, but that the people on kind of the lower end, the lower rungs of the economic system get a benefit too, because it's serving everyone. But there's an intentionality that communities that are more distressed and in more need are enabled to be as complete and healthy places as possible. Let me just jump down. You can read the other couple of these. Authentic participation is another thing that's really fun to see emerge here. And I loved some of what Nicole talked about in her presentation with what's happening with that and citizen engagement in the Seattle area. So again, it's more than just saying we've had some public hearings, we've had a period to take public comment, and we've done our job. No, it's something where the community needs to own the planning, it needs to participate in its development, it needs to own the goals and objectives that are put into place, work through alternatives, have as much a consensus as possible with direction, and not just stop there, and this gets to the final point there, implementation, that the community is part of actions and steps to make this reality happen and to monitor it. So are we doing the things that we said we would do through this process, and are we getting the results that we anticipated? Moving on then to regional planning here. These are 6 trends that I'm working on right now with my research. Again, sustainability is beginning to become very prominent in the whole concept of multi-jurisdictional, interjurisdictional planning as well. Again, we've gone from a period of siloed planning in regional planning. One agency is responsible for air quality, another agency is responsible for transportation, dozens of agencies are dealing with water. So bringing that together in a more cohesive, holistic framework here. Finding new partnerships. So typically regional planning in the U.S. is often just a club of elected officials from the local jurisdictions in that region. I mean, how can we reach out to other stakeholders, citizens at large, create a sense of being a regional citizen and participating and offering value to that process as well. New approaches we're seeing for implementation. The traditional pattern's been to just kind of pass through money that regions get to localities. So finding ways that universities, for example, can pick up initiatives. That's happening in Seattle right now with open space planning, that the Bullitt Foundation that Nicole mentioned and the University of Washington have decided to own and develop a very mature, integrated open space plan for the entire urban area there in central Puget Sound. I want to get into demographic changes here in a minute, and then a lot of new tools in places as well here. One quick issue to kind of share what I'm talking about. I felt like I had to share some law stuff with law people here. So here's a bunch of regulations that kind of give foundation to the current generation of water planning that we're engaged with. So a lot of this came through federal and state statutes in the 60s and 70s, when we really saw toxic, awful, polluted issues in our waterways and rivers and lakes and streams, to really pull things together and create things that aren't so toxic and healthy. This is just a fun thing I put together here to, again though, early on this was still just very fragmented, different entities doing different things here. We're moving towards more integrated regional water planning here, and as I go through this, other issues that have that water relationship. So open space, habitat, climate are all beginning to come into play in more integrated planning around water. And what I wanted to get to here, what's been missing is that land use connection. So we're just beginning to bring that into play. Transformation of regional planning, I want to dovetail on something Chris said about the, 50 to 70 million new housing units we're going to need in the U.S. You need to know they need to be different types of housing from what we did the last 50 years. So the majority of people by the year 2035 are going to be in one of these demographic groups, either seniors, single-person households, startups, or single-parent households. So that will be the majority. That requires new ways of thinking about housing, new types of housing products, and different ways in which we create communities and neighborhoods here. Lessons from urban design. Let me go back to this quickly. Again, if you haven't gotten it yet, I really want to make the point. It's more than aesthetics. We often just say that. Again, it's this whole systems approach here and bringing multiple issues, function, relationships, collaboration together in your decision-making process. A fun project I'm really honored to have worked on during my time in Seattle was to actually create a regional design strategy for 86 jurisdictions. So again, this is more than aesthetics or the type of tiles or you have on roofs or brick color or so on. It's really how do we go about looking at things much more in focus, in much more depth, and much more holistically. This helped our elected officials hugely get beyond that dilemma that Chris mentioned. Two things people hate, or the one thing they hate more than sprawl is density. I mean, having this conversation allowed our elected officials and allowed people to begin to think there was a way to bring on density while still maintaining neighborhood character in all that they valued. But it did mean going in, changing regulations, looking at new ways of doing things here.
Rocky, just so you know, your time is now up.
All right, I think I'm on my two last slides here. So from the land use slide I showed you before, these other issues need to come into play. Mega regional planning is another thing that maybe we can chat about a little bit during my Q&A time here. I think the Salt Lake area needs to be proud. It's just a little smidge there among these other huge mega regions here. But I mean, this region has shown the way to do integrated planning from Provo to Ogden, Salt Lake, and in between. And that's another emerging phenomenon here. So I'll shut up at that point and we'll move on. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? All right, good. There's two remotes here. Which one? The big one. All right. Hi, my name's Rob Bennett. I'm the CEO of a small fledgling startup called EcoDistricts, and we're going to, for the last 20 minutes, sort of take it down to a finer grain, the grain of the neighborhood. That's the area that we work at, and it's really instructive to sort of follow Jonathan and Rocky to sort of set the context for the kind of work that we're trying to do. And really what we're all about at EcoDistricts, and I think really what many cities are struggling to do, is to understand the multiple layers and the multiple sort of scales in which to work to try to embed sustainability, to be able to activate great communities, to heal our cities in many instances, and then deal with this emerging issues that we've been talking about around resilience and climate change and other impacts that are having profound effects on our cities and our infrastructures. So we have these converging issues playing out in our cities. Our cities are growing. Our cities also are the centers of aging infrastructure. And as I think Jonathan, in one of his slides, in New York alone, they face a $46 billion infrastructure deficit, while that city is trying to mitigate a variety of other issues just to be viable and vibrant. So for us at EcoDistricts, we tend to think that the neighborhood is one of the most important scales to work in. It's really where our lives play out. Many sociologists talk about the zip code being the most important number and the most important sort of issue in which your lives ultimately play out positively or negatively. The quality of the schools, the safety of your neighborhoods, the conditions in which you live within 5, 10, 20, 30 blocks really are important to the ability to thrive going forward. So how we design our cities is important in our regions, but ultimately how we design our neighborhoods is important too. And I think that the work that Jane Jacobs and other activists in the 60s and 70s did to put a finer point on neighborhoods, while they were focusing on healing neighborhoods or sort of protecting neighborhoods from bad ideas around transportation, preserving buildings, they were ultimately protecting their cities and really sort of casting a new agenda around neighborhoods as that center of innovation and the need to be very focused on how we do urban design, how we do historic preservation, how we do infrastructure deployment, how we think about schools and other last mile transportation needs that really are important for our livelihoods. Also in this space, I think in the land use planning realm, and I'm a planner by background as well, is to acknowledge that it's a very different space in which bricks and sticks and land use law and land use planning now is playing out. There is a variety of people and ideas and sort of disruptions that have made their way into the work, from Majora Carter being one of the great voices on environmental justice, to Jan Gehl, who's one of the world's predominant urban designers, to Aaron Barnes, who actually sits on my board of directors, who's reinventing how you do financing and create a new generation of citizen activists who are doing work in their neighborhoods. All of these people are really transforming our cities. Tony in Las Vegas, selling Zappos and putting a lot of money into the downtown of Las Vegas, and having a sort of a different view in which economic activity and vibrancy sort of meet. So there's a really interesting coming together of people and ideas ultimately that are having a profound impact on how we build our cities and our neighborhoods. And we at EcoDistricts feel very strongly that neighborhoods and sort of the green and sustainability movement isn't about, it's a finer grained strategy that ultimately plays out to unleash innovation, to spark our collective imagination. And so it's about more than just the professional business of urban planning, design, reinventing and becoming, being able to deal with some of these issues that we've been talking about, but really trying to activate our communities in a different conversation as well. So what I'm going to talk about for the next 15 or so minutes is a strategy to try to reinvent neighborhood development and with governance and new models of governance very much in mind that have to address the things that both Rocky and Jonathan were talking about around loosening up some of the regulatory hurdles by reinvigorating legal structures and frameworks and ultimately a governance to be able to bring some of that kind of infrastructure and some of that new investment that we know our neighborhoods need and ultimately our cities need to thrive. And when we talk about eco-districts, you would think in its name we're talking about an environmental agenda, but as Rocky was mentioning, we are very much focused on a sustainability agenda. And I'm going to talk for a few minutes about a new product, a framework that we've been creating over the last 7 years called the EcoDistricts Protocol that we're actually introducing in a couple weeks that really does focus on the integration around the triple bottom line of sustainability. And so when we talk about EcoDistricts, we're talking about a very practical set of solutions around incremental and important investments that happen in neighborhoods, existing brownfields, greenfields as well, but really trying to make our cities and our neighborhoods more resilient and more vibrant places to live. So a typical neighborhood might look like this, and ultimately what we're trying to do, I think, with our work is to look at those investments, in this case, energy, both energy at the building level, reinvigorating our buildings, thinking about solar and on-site generation, integrated infrastructure, as Jonathan was mentioning, to deliver energy, thermal energy, electricity, et cetera, layering in the last mile transportation, because we know while transportation is a regional issue, it also is a fine-grained issue at the neighborhood. How it plays out and how people ultimately can get around both digitally and through travel. There's a variety of very smart and focused issues and strategies that we need to address at that scale. Green infrastructure, obviously, in many cities has gone from EPA funding demonstration projects to cities building into their tariff full-blown green infrastructure strategies like Philadelphia and Portland and Seattle and others. But how that green infrastructure plays out at the local level, at the neighborhood level, and links in and ultimately complements last mile transportation is really important. And you start to see 3, 4, 5 multiple benefits to occur, from heat island effect to safety at crossings to higher quality bike infrastructure in environments, better streetscapes, et cetera. And ultimately, it's about the people who inhabit that world. We talk about resilience, we talk about equity. It's about the fine-grained nature of how people can live intergenerationally, how they can live among different classes of people, how local economic development and local services sort of plays out in those communities. And we know, and the planners have been making great strides to sort of unwind many of our land use laws that have made some of this, frankly, illegal, or we've discouraged it through land use zoning over many, many years. So that's how we view sort of the journey around neighborhood sustainability, as first identifying the strategies, but ultimately building a governance model and an implementation model to start to work and chip away and build some of the strategies that we know we need to do. So the EcoDistricts protocol is a framework that we've created, started in Portland. It was a locally based effort. I was hired 7 years ago by our former mayor to start a think tank called the Portland Sustainability Institute. And he asked me to identify a key set of strategies, regional and local, to help invigorate what he was calling the next generation of sustainability. And one of the projects that we worked on together for a few years ultimately became the EcoDistricts pilot program. It was to partner with the Portland Development Commission, our redevelopment authority, Portland State University, and the Portland Office of Planning and Sustainability to reinvigorate urban redevelopment and how it happens in urban renewal districts, in TIF and tax increment finance districts. And it was that sort of agenda and that challenge that led us to building the EcoDistricts framework, which ultimately is now the EcoDistricts protocol. We assembled 80 experts across disciplines to build that framework, and we did it again with over 120 to build the protocol in the last 2 years as we've pivoted from Portland to offer this product and this framework globally. And it really starts with a very simple premise, which is we couldn't find a comprehensive framework for delivering district scale sustainability out in the market. There's rating tools, there's best practices, there's plenty of complete streets ordinances and design guidelines. There's form-based code. There's a lot of tools in the tool chest. What we were interested in is what's the framework for helping implement. I've worked on a variety of neighborhood scale projects over the last 15 years. And if you've ever been through an eco-charrette, or if you've ever been through sort of the design process, you always start with a laundry list of wonderful project opportunities and ideas. So the lack of knowledge, or there isn't a lack of knowledge and understanding of what we can do. It's a question of if you have the right people, the right sense of leadership, and the ability to overcome many of the barriers, whether they're financial, regulatory, or culturally, to get those projects done. So many of the projects I've worked on, many of the good ideas ultimately fall off the table. So we were interested in a process and a upstream performance framework that hopefully can unleash and lend itself to a better alignment among stakeholders that are working at the district level to deliver on sustainability. So we spent, since 2009, I know the date well, August 19th, 2009, when we launched the first advisory committee for the protocol. My daughter was born that day. I had to say goodbye to my wife at the hospital, quietly sneak away because I was a staff of 2, and I had to assemble these 70 people. I didn't know my daughter was going to be born that day. And since 2009, till April 26th of this year, when we launched the protocol, we've been in a deep discovery phase. We've been in a deep sort of testing and a listening phase around how do we build a framework to do this. So we've assembled a variety of projects that have been helping us build this protocol. Today we have 11 projects across 9 cities in the U.S. We had 5 pilots in Portland previous to that. We've had over 100 experts across disciplines help us. And we think it's a pretty good document, and we think it's a pretty good framework to help support some of the work we need to do at the neighborhood level. It's a process and performance standard, as I mentioned. It will have a certification. You will be able to get certified as an eco-district, but frankly, that's not what's driving us. What's driving us is really trying to put a framework out into the world and to partner with industry and leaders in land use and leaders in integrated infrastructure and leaders in municipal policymaking and development industry to really advance on what's inside the protocol. Now, the protocol tries to do a few things. One, it's really trying to build support and alignment around common interest and to shape governance. So what we're trying to do is to send signals that we think, frankly, we need a new model of governance to shape such projects. There's thousands of special purpose districts in this country, whether they're tax increment or utility districts. There's over I think there's 300,000 plus neighborhood associations. There's thousands of business improvement or community improvement districts. So there's already a tremendous amount of legally organized, officially sanctioned districts that exist in the world. But we understand in order to move on sustainability, these special purpose districts, the leaders who oversee them, the kind of financing that could be made available to them, need to, and we think, integrate sustainability into that work. I liken the sort of challenge around this to be if you're familiar with corporate sustainability and B Corp in particular, which we think is a really powerful framework, we're in essence wanting to create the B Corp for special purpose districts and neighborhood districts where they really have to address sustainability. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that. So the protocol is a 3-step process. It has what we call 3 imperatives, 6 priority areas, and it's shaped around a 3-step implementation model. It starts with 3 imperatives: equity, climate, and resilience. So when we studied sort of global best practice around district scale sustainability projects, and of course with the emergence of resiliency becoming a major issue and Rockefeller funding 100 cities and 100 chief resiliency officers, and storms and Sandy and Katrina and the like, we understand now that the issues of disruption, both socio-economic and environment, are on us. And we felt strongly that we needed this protocol to be very clear that, in essence, these are prerequisites. These are non-negotiables. You have to develop an integrated equity, climate protection, and resiliency strategy for your district project. And so these become the sort of gateway into the project. And we think that we can make a contribution in order for, whether you're a municipal urban redevelopment authority, you're a business improvement district, you're a developer developing Mission Rock or Pier 70 in San Francisco along the waterfront, you have to deliver a strategy on those 3 issues. You have to wrestle with the trade-offs, you have to wrestle with the strategies, you have to ultimately develop the kind of financing to be able to demonstrably show that you're moving on those 3 things. So that's the first sort of gateway into the protocol. The second is a more classic, if you look at rating tools, and we studied over 100 of them globally, a set of what we call goals and objectives and metrics around a set of issues. We have 6 of them that we've identified. place, prosperity, which is really educational and economic opportunity, connectivity, both digitally and travel related, health and well-being, living infrastructure, and resource restoration. And resource restoration, we also are contemplating calling that net zero, in essence around wastewater and energy. So we're, again, requiring projects and trying to obviously encourage projects because we want the EcoDistricts brand, if you will, and those who use the protocol to be exemplar projects around the world to address each of these 6 areas. So as Rocky was saying, you know, this isn't a or, and it is about the ands, and we are smart, I think, as a species to recognize that for every investment we make, for every project that we put on the table, there are opportunities to address all these issues comprehensively and thoughtfully. Yes, there's trade-offs on economics. Yes, there's trade-offs on cultural or regulatory issues. But the job, I think, of us as urban planners, as urban regeneration leaders, as city sustainability policymakers, is to recognize that integration. Just a simple story. Our former mayor got in a lot of trouble when he, I think very cleverly and very smartly, used stormwater dollars to help build some of our bike infrastructure. So in Portland, we have gone through a transformation process, like a lot of cities are, to take our combined sewer overflow infrastructure that's over 100 years old, separate it where we can, and build some very significant green infrastructure, along with some very significant gray infrastructure, to deliver on the requirements to clean up the Willamette and the Columbia's rivers in which Portland sits. So from a regulatory perspective and from a financial perspective, money was flowing through the tariff, and our rates in Portland and Seattle as well are some of the highest in the country to pay for this infrastructure. He simply said, look, if we're going to build 719 new bioswales and infiltrations, on-street infiltration systems around key neighborhoods in Portland, why don't we start to think about overlaying our bike infrastructure so we can get, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 benefits out of that? And of course, there was a huge pushback because why should we be using stormwater utility dollar for, you know, for other kinds of infrastructure? But, you know, from a practical perspective, that's what we need to do is, regardless if the money is allocated for stormwater, if you can get other benefits and you can build other pieces of infrastructure very smartly and integrate it, we have to do it. There's just no other way. The third leg of the protocol is the process, and this is actually what I'm most passionate about as a practitioner. I'm very focused on how you get projects from sort of beginning to end, and so we have a 3-step process that starts with the formation of an eco-district. A set of stakeholders are interested in pursuing a project, ultimately delivering on an investment roadmap that focuses on baselining performance and identifying projects that have to map back to the 6 priority areas and the 3 imperatives, and then biennial reporting along the progress you're making on the project. Now, we have a process approach to this work because, frankly, neighborhoods are complex. They're always changing. Leadership changes. Investors change. And so the notion that you can create a backbone organization whose job it is to ultimately steward a project with key investors and report progress is really what we're talking about. And in order to be able to make good on those best practices, whether it's distributed utility infrastructure, bike infrastructure, a transportation management overlay, you need to have professional governed districts in order to do that, and you got to have key metrics that everyone are aligned and willing to report against. We've designed the protocol to be both typology neutral, meaning we don't use proxies. We're not suggesting that every eco-district needs to be a high-density mixed-use district. We're suggesting that in cities, there are a variety of different typologies that make up a city, and each of those neighborhoods have a sustainability agenda that they can move on. So whether you're an industrial serving area or you're primarily a commercial serving area, there's obviously much we can do. We also think that the protocol could be used on a variety of levels. It can be a tool used for community development corporations. It can be a tool used by cities and redevelopment authorities and planning departments. And it could be used, obviously, by institutions and developers who are either controlling large districts whether it's Google, who's trying to reinvent its campus in Mountain View around the concepts of EcoDistricts, or a hospital like Central Health in downtown Austin that's rebuilding the 30-block a medical campus in downtown Austin, or you're a developer like Forest City or Lend Lease that have got large urban regeneration projects, and they've got the land assembled, and they're working through entitlement and investment. So we're hoping that the protocol can be used in all three of them, and we're starting to see it in that case. And as an example, Capitol Hill Housing in Seattle has been a partner of ours. They used the protocol originally to start to organize a series of partnerships with Seattle University, the city, some other local NGOs around a sustainability agenda that was very behaviorally driven, very programmatically driven, getting solar, doing a retrofit strategy, not big bricks and sticks kind of approaches, but really trying to organize at the community level. Fast forward 4 years, and Joel, who is the director of the EcoDistricts for Capitol Hill Housing, they have just adopted the EcoDistricts protocol as their new model of community development. So they feel very strongly that community development needed to be reinvigorated around sustainability. And of course, we're thrilled that they think that, and that they're able to adopt the protocol as a tool for community development. We think the same thing, obviously, for urban regeneration or urban redevelopment authorities. They need to be modernized as well, and they need to take sustainability much more seriously, because often they oversee 5 to 10 to 20 urban renewal districts. They're bonding against future investments, and frankly, most of those urban redevelopment authorities are not asked to address sustainability in a demonstrable way, and their metrics of success are primarily economic, about land lift, about job creation, and the fact that urban redevelopment authorities are often the agencies with the biggest amount of budget in cities and have the most impact on how cities grow. The fact that they don't have a sustainability agenda that's rigorous is really both a challenge and an opportunity to help shape our cities.
Rob, that's your time, by the way.
Oh, well.
Prize.
Great. Well, I'll leave it at that then. We can get into it. I won't go through my 30 other slides.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
We do have a few minutes left for questions, so I'll repeat the question once we've heard it. Go ahead.
I would like to question the concept of green growth. Instead of building a dome around it, you should not be allowed to rebuild, but you have to give the your comments about it, especially.
So to repeat the question, it's a question about this idea of whether growth can be green or whether we need to actually start giving something back to natural systems.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think I personally totally connect with what you're saying. I did some work about 10 years or so ago in Seattle with the update of our regional plan. It was the first time we were actually bringing in issues around environment, natural systems, watersheds, and so on. And we had quite a debate about whether a damaged environment you just accept it as it is, or as opportunities present themselves, do you go back to a more natural state? You just say it was a mistake to build here in the first place, or what are your options? I think we kind of settled on a middle ground, to be honest, where we saw the opportunity to reclaim lands and create a more natural system again. We did that. Some of what we did, though, was to look at this in terms of, again, complexity. So are there ways where you're dealing with someone who owns property, they have a right to build on it? Can we look at building on that site in a way that does contribute to restoration and healing? So not necessarily saying you can't build here, but what you build here has to contribute to a restoration of the natural function. I'm just going to mention one other thing from the American Planning Association. I mean, we have an ongoing debate. We've done a lot of work in New Orleans, and you know, the jury clearly is still out on what is happening or should be happening there. Clearly, the Ninth Ward was developed in the early part of the 20th century in an area that wants to be a swamp, is a swamp, will probably be more of a swamp with issues around severe weather events and so on. But yet, a community and neighborhood existed there. I'll just say, you know, my personal observation is we're allowing it to be both, and that isn't working. You know, we're allowing development to happen, and we're allowing things to restore there, and I think it's just going to be another tragedy at some point in the future.
Either of the other panelists want to add anything?
I just add one quick thing. Excuse me. Ideologically, I agree with your point. I think one of the biggest challenges we have in trying to think about your point in this context is that there are economic and cultural influences that are part of this conversation. And so if we can characterize, or we can think about whatever the proposal is to grow the ecosystem, that it doesn't impact other individuals in a negative economic way, or doesn't impact upon various cultural biases that exist, that's probably going to be the most successful way in terms of getting this through. And I'm only talking about in terms of reality. I mean, I agree with you ideologically that this should be the sort of the primary perspective in approaching land use. But it's so difficult to overcome the economics and the traditional argument.
Other questions?
Thank you. Great presentation. I just had a quick question. It seems to me that underlying a lot of this is the need for the right types of information and the ability to maintain that information over time. So you have talked about the adaptation issues. You want to be able to respond to it, right? You want to be able to respond and know what's happening. Be able to respond to the task and need that information. Getting that information and finding useful protocols has been one of the difficult things. One thing I'm curious about is if anybody knows of information adopted that have built up over time around these that have been effective. And just thoughts on that. I mean, what kind of information is needed? How do we effectively maintain it over time? And is there some way you can scale that from one city to another?
So just to repeat the question again, the question is about the information sources and protocols that are required to have these adaptive systems that we're talking about. So where's the information coming from? How do you maintain that as a source, as a reliable source of current information?
So, and you used a good word there, the adaptation here and so on. So there is this practice, and again, I'm going to credit the design community for helping us get there, of adaptive management. So I always say, I think the first primary job of a planner is to provide the best information possible to go through discernment and decision making. And that's particularly those of us who work in the public sector, is to make sure elected officials have full information. You know, we can't control what they do with it or where they go and what their decisions always are, but, you know, we're doing our job to make sure that's full information. You run into an issue that, I mean, sometimes you just don't have all that information, and I'll talk again about quickly an example from Seattle when we were wrestling with a regional approach to climate change. I mean, we had a constituency there that said, you know, the jury's still out, and I don't need to get into the whole debate whether the jury's still out for, you know, 1 to 5% of the scientific community or just where that's all out. But they wanted us to stall doing anything, changing business as usual around either adaptation or mitigation to climate change because of that. And I mean, adaptive management allowed us to have the conversation. We're working with the best information we have now. but we're giving ourselves permission as more information comes into play to be able to adapt or update decisions that we've put onto the books.
I think, there's, at the scale we work at, there's a lot of information. It's a question of how that information sort of gets down to those who are making investments, and ultimately, how they filter that and make, ultimately move on that information. One of the things we worked on, for instance, most cities have had climate action plans for many, many years, but trying to make that actionable has been the problem. And simple things like requiring a district or a plan unit development to have to analyze its climate footprint or its energy footprint, knowing that the city's had a policy for 20 years, actually elevates the conversation about what those investments around green infrastructure, around distributed utilities, around building efficiency, and it identifies a variety of barriers and sort of conflicts within often the code, or the city even getting clear about the role it's want to play to potentially co-invest in that. So I'm not sure it's so much a lack of information. It's a question of sort of filtering that information down to when investments get made or land use decisions get ultimately executed, and then finding out the ways to sort of mitigate where there is conflict. Food access is another really interesting one. Rocky mentioned that at sort of the bottom. Food deserts and the role that quality food plays in health and wellness of communities has just emerged as an issue. And now, because of that, you're starting to see a much more focused effort around how do we measure health and wellness at the community level, and the public health industry is absolutely starting to develop very clear metrics, and then how that ultimately gets to municipal investment, state investment, and private investment, from grocery stores to a variety of tactics to get health and wellness sort of on the table. So I do think it's really moving key data sets down into the investment, which is the biggest challenge.
And the only thing I'll add, because I agree with all these in terms of the sort of the framework and the general comments, is some specific examples. First of all, I think the Dubuque example is an excellent one, right? Because they went through a very intensive program. They looked at 1,000 indicators, ultimately selected 60 that were the most appropriate for their community. That's part of it. But then we can start to work our way down the scale in terms of one of the ordinances that we proposed as a model ordinance at Drake is an auditing requirement, an energy auditing requirement and disclosure for commercial buildings. So we're starting to get the information out there, right? And then if you even go down to the sort of the lowest scale in terms of spatial scale, there are a number of issues concerning smart meters, whether we're talking about energy or even water now. There's a program called AquaHawk, which I think is run out of the EPA, which is providing individual owners with up-to-date, immediate information concerning their water use. Once we get that information, then we can begin to adapt. But your question is really the threshold question, right? If we don't have the information, we can't really move forward from there.
I don't want to keep people from their lunch. But if there's one more burning question out there, we'd like to field it if anyone has that. Now I'm putting the onus on that last person. All right, Cameron, go for it.
Uh-huh.
The brief paraphrasing being how have TIFs been related to EcoDistricts, I think.
There's a fair amount of flexibility that redevelopment authorities have to distribute those dollars for projects. So, and a lot of tax increment districts are in low-income communities. In fact, our Portland pilot, two of the 5 were low-income communities. The issue, of course, with tax increment is that you need investment to stimulate growth, and so in many low-income communities, it's just so slow to get that investment moving, and therefore the ability to release the dollars. I would say, though, as an example, is we use tax increment funding to study and analyze a distributed utility system in one project. And that was a new sort of idea that hadn't been sort of tested and approved through any of the tax increment districts. In this case, this is Portland. So I think that there is a fair amount of flexibility to be able to look at integrated infrastructure and some other strategies to obviously offset some of the costs through loans or forgivable loans or grants around rehabilitation of buildings, around implementing green infrastructure. So I think there's a lot to work with there. It gets more difficult when you're starting to talk about an integrated infrastructure system that has, franchise agreement, requirements, and that ability for a system to sort of sit inside of a tax increment district. It just is going to need another level of governance and another level of legal structuring.
Just quickly, I can say when I worked in Washington State, it was not allowed as a tool, and we pined for it. We made a little movement a few years ago to link it into programs around protecting rural areas and transferring those development rights into areas that were designated for urban development. We call that kind of TIF light, but that's relatively new. I don't know that we can critique it yet. In Colorado, I'll say there's been a little bit of drama that the legislature's actually looked at maybe abolishing it as a tool. And from my experience in the city of Denver, I'll say there has been some criticism that it's just kind of assumed for any redevelopment site that TIF will just be part of the financing, and is it really being used strategically enough? And do the developers who are putting together their investment package, do they just rely that that's a given, and could they come up with the financing anyway, and TIF could be applied someplace else where it might get more bang for the buck? So.
Well, please join me in thanking our panelists.